Welcome to Season 11, Episode 36 of the Ubuntu podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk to Andrew Katz about open source and the law. We'll also have some command line love, and we'll go over your feedback. I'm Mark, and joining me this week are Alan.
Hello.
And Martin.
Good evening.
I don't know why that was funny.
No, neither do I.
Alan, what have you been doing since last we spoke?
Well, in part 5 of my lament that Lenovo Yoga laptops are a pile of rubbish, I have been trying to resize the partition on that said laptop because it came with a 1 terabyte spinning rust disk, which is incredibly slow. This is for previous listeners. You'll remember this is the laptop I bought for my daughter, and as a terrible father, I didn't buy her a proper ThinkPad. I bought her a Lenovo Yoga
with not very much RAM at all.
Well, I've upgraded the RAM, and next up was to replace the spinning rust with an SSD.
Right.
And because I can't really justify buying a 1 terabyte SSD because I haven't got Bitcoin up the wazoo like Martin, I decided to buy a slightly smaller SSD, a 250 gigabyte model.
Right.
And I thought, well, I could resize the disk down, the spinning rust, and then DD that across or somehow get that across. And it's been a complete nightmare. I took the drive out of the machine and put it in a USB 3 caddy so that I could attach it to my laptop and do operations on it like outside of her laptop. She hasn't needed it for a few days, which is good because
has it taken a few days?
Yes. I thought the very first thing I do before I do anything to this laptop is image it. Yeah. And so I mounted I first of all tried DDing the whole drive off with DD Rescue onto my server by plugging it into the server, but that's only USB 2 and it would take days. So I unplugged it from the server and then plugged it into my laptop. I don't have a terabyte of space to DD the image off. So I mounted via Samba my home server from my laptop and then DD'd over the network directly to the home server. That was good. That was successful. That still took a long time.
Was that quicker than USB 2?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Like by a factor of 10. Like it was so much faster. So I got the image off and then I thought, right, now I could start resizing it. So I used Gparted on the disk and I shrank down the main Windows partition. And then there was a whole bunch of Lenovo partitions down the end of the disk and I moved them to the left-hand end of the disk and I just left that running for hours and hours and hours. I actually had to walk away from my desk because I was so scared that I was going to misclick or do something bad and ruin it. So I walked away and came back and it had all finished. And then I thought because I've resized it below the size of 250 gig, I could just DD it across from the old disk to the new disk.
Oh.
Disk to disk.
I sense a but.
Yeah. Yeah, that didn't really work. It ran out of space because I think it still thinks it's a terabyte drive. Oh. So I've reset her terabyte drive because I mentioned this on Twitter, which is my technical support avenue of choice. And someone, Alan Jude, who's a big fan of BSD, suggested that I actually use the built-in Windows disk resizing tool. Apparently that's more reliable than using things like Gparted. But then he would say that because he hates all things that run on Linux. So that's my next thing. I've now restored the image back onto the disk. And my next step in this multi-part saga about improving this laptop is to put the drive back in the machine, boot into Windows, then resize all the partitions and move them all down. Apparently you can do this in Windows reliably. Then take it out, then do the DDing across. And if anyone has any tips on how to do this reliably, then feel free to write in because by the time you listen to this, I still won't have finished this job and she won't have her laptop. It will still be in bits on my desk. So I would welcome the feedback.
I've got an idea for you.
What's that?
Have you tried using Clonezilla?
Yes.
Can you not Clonezilla from spinning?
Fails. Nope.
Oh, really?
It won't do the big disk to small disk. There are options you can use to override that, but it still doesn't work. Would you like a 1 terabyte SSD, Alan? I feel like this is like the fast path to success. To be honest, I'd rather have the Bitcoin. But yes, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. But if any tips, gratefully appreciated. Thank you.
Right. On that note, let's get on with the show. And this week on the show, we're joined by Andrew Katz. Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
Now, Andrew, you are a lawyer. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, that's true. Yes.
Is it the bad type of lawyer or the good type of lawyer?
There's only a good type of lawyer.
Of course. We'll be the judge of that.
All right, fair enough.
Well, so I suppose the obvious question is, to start you off, why do open source people need a lawyer?
It's all to do with licensing, I guess. So, a lot of people, when they start getting involved in free and open source software, they sort of have a look and see there's all this splendid code out there and they can just grab it and use it and do whatever they want with it. But as we all know, just because it's sort of free for the grabbing and using doesn't mean it doesn't have licenses attached to it. So it's navigating between exciting things like Apache and BSD and GPL and AGPL and that's one of the things that I help people with.
So what sort of people do you work with? Is this just like bedroom hackers or just big companies, or do you work with all sorts of people?
It's a huge range. So I've sort of worked with some of the biggest companies around, and I also help individuals and startups and foundations, and quite a lot of the work that I do revolves around, when one company wants to buy another company and the second company's got a whole bunch of software, you need to do some due diligence to see what the software is, what the licenses are, to make sure that they've been complying with the terms. So, I go in and examine the licenses and make sure they're all compatible and that the purchaser is getting what they're expecting to get.
And on that point, some years ago, Andrew advised me in a past job.
Indeed.
Our company wanted to adopt an open source model for all of our core technologies, and you helped us choose the right license to achieve what we wanted to do and put all that together and help us release all of our technologies under open source licenses.
Is it really that hard that there isn't like a auto license selector website thing where you just like, I'm not saying like an Insta lawyer, button like The Simpsons.
Yeah. Well, there are license choosers. I mean, a few sort of websites out there will help to do that. But I take a more holistic approach. I really like to understand the philosophy of the individual involved and what they're aiming to do. And, GPL people are very different from Apache type people. And you've got to try to, it's a little bit like determining what star sign somebody has. His mark, he looks like sort of LGPL sort of chap to me.
I'm not sure how to take that.
I like to fit the license to the individual, really make sure it's the right license for the right person, and if I can do that, it's a job well done.
Of the licenses that are available, is there one that is more prevalent that comes out of these consultations these days for your clients?
Not really. I mean, there's a small group of licenses that, I don't want anyone to sort of choose any bizarre licenses. So, I mean, normally they'll end up with, GPL, LGPL, Mozilla, Apache, BSD, really. And if one of those licenses doesn't work for you, then, you've got to look pretty carefully at why.
So you try and avoid the long tail of that big list that you get on the OSI and FSF websites.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And when projects relicense, they tend to relicense to the more common licenses as well. So we all hate license proliferation, which is why I like drafting licenses. So I try and steer people in the direction of the top 5 most common licenses, basically.
Are these ever a blocker for you talked about, a company purchasing another company or purchasing the assets of a company? Is it ever a blocker that, someone decided to use the WTF license or, the Don't Be Evil license or something that's not Debian Free Software Guidelines friendly or something? Is it ever like that much of a problem that it goes to the top of the tree? And
it can be. It can be. I mean, it really depends what the purchasing company wants. So generally speaking, if the purchasing company is buying something that they want to run it on a SaaS basis, then I'm much more relaxed about the licenses that are being used, because it's actually quite difficult to be non-compliant as far as licenses that are sitting behind sitting on a server. If, on the other hand, there's an organization that's purchasing some software that's firmware, it's sitting in a device, so it's going on a phone or it's going on a router or something like that, then you've got to be significantly more careful about that. And that can be a blocker. And I've had circumstances where I've looked at the code base and said, listen, guys, we can't use this. So there's a number of ways you can deal with it. I mean, you can go back to the original author and say, listen, the license you've chosen for this is a problem. These are the circumstances in which we want to use it. And they could say, okay, we'll let you have it under BSD, or we'll let you have it under BSD if you pay me some money, or no, not a chance. Or you have to go back to the engineers and say, is there some way that we can re-engineer that so that we're not using that particular component? So there's a number of ways that you can deal with that problem.
And do you get the militant types who just absolutely will not relicense, even if you throw a bag of money at them?
Yeah, that happens from time to time.
I guess principles are an important thing to have these days.
Exactly. Although it depends on the size of the bag of money, I guess. I've never been given one bag big enough really to sort of test that theory.
So we've just spoken a lot about software licensing, which we're fairly familiar with, but you've worked with hardware licensing as well, haven't you? How's that different?
So hardware is really, really interesting. And I came to open source hardware a slightly different way from most people, because the first projects that I got involved with are actually mechanical projects. So there's a project called River Simple, and they produced a hydrogen-based car. And they're very keen to open source that technology, and I've been talking to them for ages about the way in which that they can open source that. But physical hardware is very, very different from software in a lot of ways. And most people who are looking at open hardware licensing are thinking of things like circuit boards, or they're thinking about things like FPGAs and bit streams, and those have a much more software-y feel to them. So you can deal with a license that's much more similar to an open source software license, and in some cases you can just use a license like GPL v3 for dealing with things like bit streams, but it's not going to work when you're talking about a car. So I developed a couple of licenses. One of them is basically a hack of Apache, which is called the SolderPad license, and it's really a wrapper around the SolderPad license. The Apache license, which just makes it more suitable for hardware, and it just expands some of the definitions in there, so it's clear that you're not only dealing with software, but you're dealing with physical objects as well. And that was an easy job. Much more complicated is I've been involved with CERN on the CERN Open Hardware license, and that's a copyleft license for hardware, which sort of brings all of its own interesting challenges. And we're in the middle of producing version 2 of that at the moment. But CERN has, they've developed quite a lot of hardware themselves. There's some sort of fun circuit boards, a project called White Rabbit, which enables you to determine whether an event taking place kilometers apart has happened within nanoseconds of each other. Very important if you're doing particle physics. And they've released all of this stuff under an open hardware license. And what we're finding is that the first draft was intended to be something that really could cover the whole spectrum of hardware, but people who wanted to use it for mechanical devices were saying, well, it doesn't quite work for us. And people who wanted to use it for things like FPGAs were saying it doesn't quite work for us. So we've taken a much more sort of GPL v3 type approach with version 2, which lets you select various modules for the license depending on the sort of hardware that you're dealing with. So there's something that will let you deal with, if you're dealing with FPGAs, and there's another module that's sort of like a weak copyleft module and so on. So that's the approach we've taken there.
Isn't that more tricky to enforce hardware licenses, given like with software it's very easy to once someone's taken your work, made a derivative of it, and then distributed it, like there's a digital copy somewhere, you can inspect that digital copy, but for there to be a physical copy of something, you've got to go to where the physical copy of the thing is and see it, observe the thing, that there was a license breach.
Yes, it is significantly more difficult. And I think trying to map one onto the other is something that isn't that straightforward. So one of the things where the CERN Open Hardware license differs from open source software licenses is that if you are a recipient of one of the objects whatever it happens to be, that was made under this license, that automatically gives you as the recipient, this is one of the things that we're looking at. So it gives you the right as a recipient to be able to enforce the license and get hold of the original design documentation. So this is where it gets highly technical, but open source license says it's only the copyright holder who can enforce. So, if you've got a problem under GPL, you've got some GPL binaries, but you can't get hold of the source code. Ultimately, you're going to have to get hold of one of the copyright owners of the original code and say, listen, the person who distributed this to me is misbehaving. They're not distributing the source code to me. Can you sort this out, please?
So you need a Bruce Perens type person who's willing to go and fight for it.
Exactly. But what we're looking at as one of the options with the CERN open hardware license is to say, what happens if we give the recipient of the hardware themselves the right to do that? Now, people have been very resistant to that happening in the world of software, because it means that as a copyright holder, if you're not, as anyone really who's distributing the software, if you're not careful, you potentially end up with hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people who've got a potential claim against you if you misbehave. But I think the major difference between hardware and software is that with software, because you're copying it the whole time, anything you're doing with it involves copying it. If you're running it, you need to copy it. If you're modifying it, you need to copy it. All of these things require copying. If you distribute it, you're going to be copying it. So every time you copy it, you got the opportunity for a license to impinge. So that happens an awful lot as far as software is concerned. With hardware, you don't necessarily get that, because an awful lot of things you can do with hardware, you can do without copying it.
Right.
So it seems that to balance that, seems that, and I don't know whether this is the right answer or not, but it's just something we're throwing out there, is actually if the recipients are able to enforce against somebody who's non-compliant and require them to disgorge the design documentation, then maybe that's a step forward. But we're early days yet. We don't know whether that's something that's going to work or not.
That's fascinating.
So something that's come up recently in the sort of licensing news is there's been a lot of hoo-ha around some new licenses and license clauses that have been doing the rounds among open source projects. And the most prominent ones of these are something called the Commons Clause, which Redis, the caching system, have been using, and a new license applied to MongoDB, which they say they're trying to get approved by the Open Source Initiative. And there's been quite a lot of concern around, you mentioned before, license proliferation not generally being a good thing, but also how these are trying to change the way that the software can be used in ways that may or may not be compatible with the spirit and indeed the definition of open source.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on this from your point of view?
Let's start with MongoDB. So this is quite an interesting one, and Richard Stallman has for many years talked about a business model that he calls selling exceptions to the GPL. And I did have a little played a little sort of mental game with myself a few years ago, and I thought, I wonder what the most complex license is that I can come up with, the most business unfriendly license that I can possibly imagine that is still technically compliant with the open source definition and the Free Software Foundation guidelines, because that would be a great license for an organization that wanted to sell exceptions to it. So basically you can say this is open source software because it technically fulfills the definition, but it's just a license that looks so scary that any organization that goes anywhere near it thinks there must be a better way, at which point bing, salesman appears next to you and says, yes, there is.
Right.
So, and I wouldn't like to suggest that that's MongoDB's business model at all. That was just a sort of, little coincidental observation. But it's interesting to note that, GPL has a reputation in some organizations for being a license that they're very wary about having in their companies. So if you look at MySQL, if Oracle, a salesperson appears and says, have an exception, that could be regarded as being a way of making money. So, either it is, the trouble is there's an equally valid argument on either side. So there's the selling an exception to the GPL or server-side public license, AGPL, whatever it happens to be, argument. And then there's the other argument that says, well, hang on, there really is this problem of copyleft not really working properly when software is sort of buried deep in the stack. What are we going to do about that if it's hidden in the cloud? People really don't get access to the source code. So it's not quite as simple as saying, it's evil or it's good. But it's just interesting to note some of the companies that are doing this, what their possible rationale might be for doing this.
But the essential problem which they're dealing with is the fact that they want their software to be open and available to the people who are using it. But if a company is building essentially a proprietary service around it, then they might not necessarily be doing something with it which requires them to then make the source code available, and people might not even know that the product's being used, so people might not then seek it out and contribute to it, or
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to give a sort of classic example of this, I mean, Google is very open that their Google search engine technology is based on very heavily modified version of the Linux kernel. And because this is obviously something that runs purely in the cloud and nobody's actually running any of that code on their own computer, it means it's never distributed. And because it's never distributed perfectly legitimately, Google is able to do that, and they don't have to share those modifications with anyone. So, then get into the sort of philosophical question, well, does that mean that that's against the spirit of free software? If they're taking advantage of this and providing a lot of functionality to a lot of people, does that then mean that they should be forced to make that source code available?
And what's your position on that?
I don't know. I mean, it depends what day it is, basically.
Right. I'm not constituting this as legal advice, by the way.
No, absolutely. I mean, I tend to think it. I tend to think it's evil to do that.
The gut feeling is that they shouldn't be able to do it.
My gut feeling is the software should be free. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. But as I say, it is quite strongly arguable on both sides. And sometimes I wake up in a very sort of Apache type mood, and I say, it doesn't really matter where this software is being used. The important thing is it gets used as much as possible. So I don't have a very strong and consistent view one way or the other. I do waver quite significantly on this one.
But with, one of the issues I've seen with the Commons clause coming in is that it's being presented as, here's that license that you know about, plus this other clause, which arguably makes it not an open source license anymore. So is that more of an issue in terms of the way that, is it disingenuous that people are licensing their software in that way? Or is it?
Yeah, I'm very uncomfortable about that. I think if you're honest about what you're doing, then I have sort of mixed views. For example, on the Creative Commons non-commercial license,
because that's essentially what the Commons clause does.
It is similar in a way. Yeah, exactly. So what the Commons clause is basically saying, it's a sort of modified version of the Apache license, but it's saying that if you flog this software without adding any value, you're not allowed to do this. So if you just take it as is, package it and sell it, that's a no-no. If, on the other hand, you add some value by modifying it in some way, making significant changes to it, incorporating it into another product, that's fine. You're allowed to do that. I think the fundamental problem is that it's made to sound as though it's open source, but it isn't. I mean, there is no question it does not fall within the open source definition, because that is a restriction, and that's not permissible. So I think it sort of confuses people. And in my less charitable moments, I find myself thinking, is that confusion deliberate? So I'm not super happy about that as an idea.
Right. Right, we're nearly out of time, but I think you just wanted to give a plug for something else you've been working on, which is OpenChain. So do you want to tell us a bit about that quickly?
I will say very quickly. Yeah, so it's part of it's one of the projects of the Linux Foundation, and basically it's a software supply chain management, quality management program. And the idea is that, I mentioned earlier about one company buying another company, and it means that the purchasing company has to do a lot of due diligence, figuring out exactly what all the code is and where the licenses are, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is to put some structure around that, to say that if you're a good actor in the open source world, you'll make sure that you have somebody you can identify who's responsible for open source. You'll make sure all of your developers understand sort of basics about licensing, this sort of thing. You have somebody that can handle complaints. You have a good method for figuring out what all the software comes in, what licenses are subject to, and whether they're compatible with the licenses going out. And you have some mechanism for making sure you comply with them all. So that, in a nutshell, is what OpenChain is.
Like a sort of code of practice for people who do open source stuff with other businesses.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a bit like a quality assurance program. So the idea is that, if you're, dealing with a company that's ISO 27001 accredited, that means that you can take a lot of what that accreditation says at face value. You then don't have to basically do re-accreditation of the company yourself. So it's the same idea as if you're dealing with somebody who's developing open source and they're OpenChain compliant, then that means that that they've got the documentation, etc., that's required.
Cool. Great. So if people want to find out more about what you're up to, where can they find you online?
Morecrofts.com is the first place to go. If they want to find more about OpenChain Project, that's openchainproject.org.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Great. Thank you.
Are you a freedom-hating iTunes user? Redeem yourself by helping spread the word about Ubuntu and open source. Leave a rating to tell others what you think of the Ubuntu podcast.
And now it's time for Command Line Love. And Martin's got a love for us this week.
I do have a love, and it is called Hub. And it's a project made by GitHub, and they pitch it as Hub is a command line wrapper for Git that makes you better at GitHub.
I need this.
You do, and I shall tell you why.
Oh my God, I pushed some code and replaced someone's master branch today for a significant open source project. They gave me access to their private repository and I just went, git push, splattered it. I was like, oh, I'm really sorry. So yes, I need this.
There's a guy that set up a Git repo that the idea is that it contains names of open source lawyers, and it's also self-selected because basically you've got to be able to drive Git to be able to put your name on there. And so far, only one guy has. It's only been open for a couple of days. I was going to leap in and try it, but I thought I'd let somebody else have a go first. So only one guy's managed to get himself up there. Who's a guy that I know, fantastic lawyer called Carlo Piana in Italy. But yeah, I could do with that definitely.
So tell us about Hub, Martin.
Right, well, first of all, you'll need to install it, and that's just snap install hub.
Of course it is.
And it wraps a lot of the common commands, so you can hub branch and hub clone and all the rest of it, but then it has some quite sophisticated sort of compound arguments. So you're like this one, Alan. If you're you change directory on your local machine to where your GitHub project is, and you type hub CI status, and it will tell you whether or not your Travis builds are passing or not.
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
You can also hub issue, which will give you a list of the current open issues for the project that you're in, or you can even create issues from the command line with that. And this is a great one. So you've been working on your local branch of a project, and you can do hub pull request, and it will automatically create you a pull request on GitHub based on the branch that you're working in. So, yeah.
Does it stay logged in and everything? Do you use a token?
Yeah,
and all that, so
you log it in, and then that token is used. And here's the real good one. You know that workflow, which is you fork a GitHub repository, you do some work on it, you send a pull request to a project, and then months later you want to do some other work on it. And the typical GitHub workflow is go and delete that fork of the project and then fork it again. Well, Hub Sync solves that for you. So Hub Sync will go and sync all of the branches from the original master thing into your fork.
This is fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. So if you really want to supercharge your GitHub workflow, snap install Hub.
Brilliant.
Did you know you can come and chat with us and other listeners in between shows? Come and join us in our Telegram group at ubuntupodcast.org/Telegram.
And now it's time for all your wonderful feedback. And first up, Richard Browning emailed us at show@ubuntupodcast.org.
Anki is a revision aid using flashcards, but it's amazingly customizable. You write a single card using plain text, HTML or LaTeX, and then using the close markup can disguise which bits of information are hidden from the card. When reversing, the card flashes up with missing words and you have to guess them. Once you reveal the answer, you score yourself. The better you do, the longer it is before you see the card again. Get it wrong and it will repeat it within the next couple of minutes. However, this is where the request for help comes in. Since upgrading to 18.10, Anki is no longer available with the install version of Qt and won't run. I was thinking this would be a perfect for a snap. Is there some kind soul who'll be willing to have a look at this? That's interesting. I'd never heard of this thing.
I have. I'm pretty sure someone integrated it with Moodle a few years ago.
Huh. Yeah, we'll take a look. I'll have a look tomorrow when I'm in the office.
Oh, excellent. Nice one.
Or I'll have a look last week when we recorded.
Oh no, we've gone timey-wimey again.
Yeah.
Ian Forbes emailed.
I would just like to let everyone out there know that I really appreciate everyone making a concerted effort to use the horrible abomination of a phrase, reaching out, as often as possible. I thought I would become immune, but I still bristle every time I hear it. I hope your listeners are proud of themselves. Sad face. On another note, altogether, can any of you explain the difference between KDE Neon and Ubuntu? Both are based on Ubuntu and use the KDE desktop, yes? I am only interested because I have picked up a dirt cheap HP EliteBook and decided to plonk Ubuntu 18.04 on it. What a beautiful computing experience it is. Well done to everyone involved.
It's quite easy to explain the difference between KDE Neon and Ubuntu. KDE Neon is faster moving, and so you'll get newer versions of the various KDE applications and the Plasma desktop, whereas Ubuntu is effectively frozen in time version of KDE Neon. It will get bug fixes and might get a few software updates, but it won't go major revisions up within the Ubuntu archive because it fits in the Ubuntu archive, so it uses the same method for software updates as all the Ubuntu flavors, whereas KDE Neon sits outside of Ubuntu, based on Ubuntu, but with their own repository added on, in which they can rev much faster on their own packages.
And also, I think KDE Neon is also always based on Ubuntu LTS, isn't it? Whereas Ubuntu is based on whichever version it is.
True.
Next, Hamish D emailed a command line love.
Rip grep is an amazingly fast alternative to grep. I once ran it in my home directory by mistake. Sounds like something I would do. And it took a moment, but not that long. You can read a long article about how it compares with other grep-like tools and how it achieves that. Debs are available and they do appear to be snaps, but I'm not sure how well they're maintained. That's interesting. I'd never heard of rip grep.
No, I gave it a quick go, and it appeared to be quicker than grep.
Huh, that's exactly what you want, isn't it?
Yep. Brian Walton emailed.
I was pleased to hear you discuss accessibility in a recent feedback section. This is a fascinating subject that may benefit more detailed discussion. Maybe you might consider a segment that covers the subject with contribution from industry experts and users. This may help to improve listeners' understanding of the challenges that users and developers face in providing and using accessible applications, and encourage developers to consider accessibility during design rather than depend on bolt-on features, e.g. those provided by the OS. Yes, that's a good idea.
That is a good idea. We should do that. Pedair emailed.
I recently discovered your podcast on Mastodon and have been catching up on the episodes from this season. On a brief side note, my podcast player only goes back to season 8. I wonder where the others are. I don't know if this falls under GUI love or command line love. However, a number of years ago, I learned about the Gwake project. I love it. However, I never hear it mentioned on Linux podcasts and I rarely see it discussed online. Right. So the first point about where's seasons 1 to 7, the best place to find those is on our YouTube channel. They've all been archived up on YouTube. We had a rebranding between season 7 and 8 and a new website, and we didn't carry over the episodes from the prior ones, but they're all on YouTube if you want to listen to those. And as for Gwake, I use a thing called Tilda, which does much the same thing. And I think Gwake just didn't move on very much. I think it's still based on the older technologies.
Wasn't Tilda much lighter weight and faster launching as well?
It is, yes. Yeah.
Yes. There's also one for KDE called Yakwake.
Right, yeah.
Which uses console instead of a GNOME terminal.
Yeah, these pull-down terminals are still very popular. I know that Manjaro has one built in by default as well. I think that's something different altogether as well.
There's one for Windows called CMD, which supports WSL as well.
I used to use these, but I found the problem I have is I open lots of them, lots of tabs, and then the button bar at the bottom that lets you switch between them gets too big and goes off the edge, and it's really hard to scroll left and right to get back to the first terminal. So I end up using Byobu in a terminal.
Yeah.
I should just use Byobu in Tilde or inside Quake or something. That would probably be easier.
That would do it.
Yeah.
Kyle McHugh emailed.
Just finished listening to Season 11, Episode 33, and you mentioned that you plan to discuss Game Shell in Episode 34. I hadn't had a ton of time to tinker with mine, but I have a few questions and ideas I'd love for you to comment on. Piano Bar is a recommended command line app for Pandora that I've gotten to run on the Game Shell. But to exit it, I have to SSH in and kill the process. Ideally, I'd like to launch it, have it start a predetermined station, and then return to the Game Shell menu while continuing to play, kind of like Alt-Tab out the terminal and back to the menu, if you will. Would something like this be possible? I'm not sure, actually, because Game Shell is very much a single a process thing. You know, you start an application and you're in that application, and by application I mean game, obviously, because it is Game Shell. And I don't think we have access to Pandora, so I can't even test that in the UK. I wonder if there's a graphical version that. Well, even then, as soon as you leave,
you still wouldn't be able
you'd
to.
Have the same problem. I'm not sure what a good solution for that is. But what I would say is, if you have any of these kind of questions, the absolute best place is on the Clockwork Pi forum. They're very friendly and they're very keen to answer questions from new people and provide new applications. So it may be that someone's already done this and someone's figured out what you need to do in order to be able to implement a kind of alt tab. It might be that there's some keyboard shortcut you could implement or something. I don't know. But that's the best place to ask because I don't know the answer.
Great. And finally, Flavius left a comment on our website, ubuntupodcast.org.
He says, try HTOP instead of... No, he doesn't. He says, try WireGuard instead of OpenVPN. Fast and very easy to install. No security problems regarding key exchange. The only two problems I see at the moment are currently no client for mobile devices, and it does not run on OpenVZ servers. Oh my goodness, are there still people running OpenVZ servers? Well. And he goes on to say, I'm using WireGuard to connect Mac OS to Linux machines, including various Raspberry Pis, and it simply works. Molvad, a Swedish VPN provider, is offering their service via WireGuard as well.
Might take a look at that then.
And that's all of your feedback this week.
Are you listening to us on our Roku channel? Help other Roku users find the Ubuntu podcast and learn more about open source by giving our channel a star rating.
And that's all for episode 36. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It was great. Sorry, I just had a cough because I realised it's nearly Christmas.
Oh, right, yes, we only have 3 more recordings to go before Christmas.
Oh, my goodness.
We better get the curry booked in.
Yes.
And the curry.
Hooray. I'm looking forward to that.
In season 12.